to that in a moment. I want to just note, as we continue to bear witness what's happening in Gaza, that this is the end of Ramadan, the feast day of Eid al-Fitr, when the Muslims around the world begin to eat again. The pictures that came out of Gaza showed people not in the mosques as Muslims usually do. We're just standing in the rubble. And the reason is that the Israelis have destroyed most of the mosques, along with most of the schools and most of the hospitals, many of the cemeteries, destroyed the wells. And I wanted to just note that that's what genocide is. It's not only the destruction of people, it's the destruction of culture. Many of the ancient ruins from thousands of years ago have been systematically obliterated by the Israelis, so that Gaza has essentially become rubble. And yet the Palestinians still celebrate Ramadan. And I just wanted to note that. And I also want to note that I have this intuition, along with many other people, that things may be drawing to a close in terms of the formal war. There appears to be many undercurrents and machinations and public statements and contradictions in what the Israelis are saying that is leading one to believe that there may be some movement toward a ceasefire, a release of the hostages, and a new phase as we all take in what has been happening there over the last 6 months. So let us continue to bear witness. Let us continue to hope. Let us continue to pray. Let us continue to support President Biden and the other leaders that they may make those decisions that are required to put that area of the world on a new footing toward the inevitability, now that a two-state solution is no longer possible, toward a one-state, a secular state, a democratic state, where Jews and Palestinians can live together like people live together in virtually every other country in the world. It's possible. We do it every day in the United States. Most countries do it every day in their countries. There's no reason why Jews and Palestinians can't live together in a single state. And so that's what I am working for, and that's what I hope and pray for. And I think changes are in the wind. So that's a very good thing. It's not guaranteed, but it appears to be that case as we speak. So thank you, everyone. And for all the Muslims in our global audience around the world, happy close to Ramadan. I want to now turn to the subject at hand today, the ongoing reflections that are consuming more and more sessions here on Humanity Rising as we move into humanity's ET moment and post-disclosure. And we've been bringing people on from all walks of life that have experienced the extraterrestrial phenomenon in many different ways. Today, I want to introduce you to Donald Schmitt, who I've recently had the pleasure of meeting, who's one of the most extraordinary figures, actually, in the entire UFO movement, because Don has been, I would say, the foremost researcher in many ways, particularly with the incident in Roswell. He's written 7 best-selling books on the UFO phenomenon. His first book, written back in 1991, called UFO Crash at Roswell, was turned into a movie. I wrote another book, which he co-authored in 2007, Witness to Roswell, which became an international bestseller and in fact was the best-selling UFO book in the world for 2 years. He's been the lead researcher for the Center for UFO Studies. He's the lead investigator for the UFO Museum and Research Center there at Roswell. He's a member of the International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research, ICER. He speaks around the world. He worked with the great astronomer Hynek, who is very well known for all of you who are in any way familiar with the history of UFOs over the last 75 years. And so brings to this conversation of humanity's ET moment, I would say, a scientific rigor and persistence, which is required for any professional investigator that's really unequaled in the whole domain of UFO studies. So, Don, I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. He's going to make a presentation about Roswell, and then we're going to have a conversation, and he'll join the after chat for a little bit so people can have a chance to talk with him then. But Don, welcome, and I turn the program over to you. Tell us about Roswell and any other thing you want to tell us by way of introduction.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. And it was such a pleasure meeting you finally, as far as just a month ago. And I truly know that it's the beginning of not only a grand adventure as we continue our own efforts as far as in enlightening and illuminating people, as far as in a subject that should fascinate all of us, no matter what one's perception or involvement. The idea that we're attracted to the movies, we're attracted to the TV shows regarding the subject matter, but we're living the real thing. It's who the TV writers and movie script writers they come to when they want information on the subject. And speaking of even movies, my favorite UFO movie still remains the original, Day the Earth Stood Still, which was directed by the late Robert Wise. And I had the wonderful, fortune of having known him personally. And when we had the premiere of our Roswell movie at the Directors Guild in Hollywood, and he came backstage, he was there. And I will never forget how he took me by both of his hands and he shook mine over and over again. And the way he went on and on, I am so proud of you boys. And coming from someone who really set not only the theme, but the very idea that not only are we being visited, but that there may be an agenda on their part, a concern that we primitive earthlings who are the upstarts in that we have now extended our own level of aggression and hostilities and things beyond even our own planet, that we may be a concern to someone else. And I think as we get into Roswell, we'll be able to demonstrate where that concern may have originated. But even getting back to the Day the Earth Stood Still, there's that wonderful scene with the alien Klaatu, who totally, is human-like in appearance, and he's meeting with the Einstein, as portrayed by another Dr. Barnard, as I recall. And Klaatu says to the scientist about something about science, looking for the truth. And Barnard would make the comment that, well, it's curiosity that makes science. And I think that's the one thing that we all have, whether, we're curious as to the historic nature of an event, or just as Dr. Hynek, my scientific director, would always remind us, or he would always, instruct us, never lose that little boy wonderment, as he would call it. The idea that we would peer into the nighttime sky and just let our imaginations just go to whatever level, possible, because we are so minuscule as far as in this whole universe. And the idea that, we're the top of the evolutionary scale, so to speak. And is it any wonder that so many of the secular scientists would like to remain, atop that level of intellect? And I would suggest that we're still at the bottom. We're still the new kids on the block, so to speak. We're still, trying to become members of the galactic neighborhood. And therein, we should always retain that level of curiosity. Now, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the status of specifically New Mexico before this all happened. And many of you who are new to the subject or historians of the UFO field, just to set a little foundation, a little background to where we were back in that summer of 1947. And I especially like to point out that whenever I lecture on college campus, I will ask the audience, especially if the faculty are present, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? And I'm always amazed when so many of the teachers will quickly respond, well, of course, Japan. Well, no. How about just 2 hours west of Roswell, New Mexico, at Trinity Site, as it became known, in July of 1945, that first detonation of the atomic bomb. And for that reason, I couldn't recommend the recent Oppenheimer movie more enthusiastically, because it's very close to the truth as to what transpired with the Manhattan Project and the events leading up to that first detonation. And so you then had ongoing atomic research at Los Alamos, just to the north. And then you had all the testing of all the captured German V-2 rockets post-World War II at the White Sands Proving Grounds. And then just south of Roswell, you had the Roswell Army Airfield, headquarters of the first atomic bomb squadron in the world, the 509th Bomb Wing. They were the elite within the military at that time, where they selected the best officers, the best pilots, crew, doctors, nurses, all stationed at Roswell in the summer of 1947. So we can have the first slide. And we'll skip that. That's the cover of the best-selling book that Jim had kindly mentioned. And I should quickly point out that we had the famous Apollo 14 astronaut, Dr. Edgar Mitchell, do the foreword for the book. And I knew Edgar very well. And Edgar lived south of Roswell at the time of the incident. And he became an outspoken champion, not only of the case, but of so many of the people involved and the officers that he would encounter specifically at the Pentagon thereafter, who would tell him right to his face that what I'm about to describe is all true. It did happen, as the eyewitnesses described, and that Edgar Mitchell, again, he spoke out, and much to his own, chagrin, as he was attacked by NASA as being senile and old. And I'm sorry, he was an American hero up to the point he started speaking out about Roswell and about UFOs in general. So with the next slide. So this is the region at that time. And you can see that we're dealing with an area that was of the most centrally sensitive, secure area of the country at that time. There was more military activity going on in New Mexico in the summer of 1947 than anywhere else in the country. The first atomic bomb, ongoing atomic research, all the testing of the rockets. And then with Roswell, as you see Roswell, as far as to the lower right-hand corner, just south of town. And so I'm pointing this out just to give you a little background. Now, I should mention the Air Force's Project Blue Book, which was the most famous of the 3 official investigations by the United States Air Force on the UFO phenomenon. According to Project Blue Book, there were more UFO sightings in New Mexico than anywhere else in the country at that time. It was as though someone else was very interested in our military potential. And what better place than New Mexico at that time? Next slide. So this is the area. This is the area of concern. You see, it's high desert. There's nothing obstructing as far as any aerial, as far as reconnaissance of the region. And I point that out because the skeptics would suggest that this was something that was of our own design. It was something that we were testing, something that had gone off course, and it just happened to be discovered at some later date. No, no, no. You see that the panoramic view of the area is unobscured. For a full 360 degrees, there is nothing to obstruct you as far as your visualization of this area. So what happens is on July 2nd, 1947, severe lightning storm in this high desert region of Lincoln County, New Mexico, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell. And ranchers would describe that between the thunderclaps, they heard what sounded like an explosion. Now it's the next morning that a ranch foreman by the name of W.W. Brazo, next slide, we'll get another view of the area. You'll see the Capitan Mountains to the west, but again, basically unobscured. It's high desert. It's open grassland where predominantly cattle and sheep will graze. So next slide.
Oops, looks like Don, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay, great. We are gonna start sharing again.
Okay,
Here we go.
next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. We're jumping because of the time constraints. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, let's back up one. Let's back up one. I'm sorry, George. Okay, so the rancher, W.W. Brazo, the foreman of the J.B. Foster Ranch, he discovers a huge debris field that covered an area of almost 9/10 of a mile of this bizarre, unusual material that neither he, other ranchers, hired hands, even a state police officer are able to identify. So it's on Sunday, July 6th, that Brazo would load up boxes of this strange material into the back of his pickup truck, make the long drive into Roswell, but he doesn't report it to the military. He reports it to the sheriff, and it's Sheriff George Wilcox who then in turn notifies the military. So it's Major Jesse Marcel, the lead intelligence officer of the 509th, who then would retrieve a box of this wreckage, take it back to the base, and demonstrating that it is rising in importance. He reports it directly to the very base commander, Colonel William Blanchard. Now, Blanchard would then dispatch Marcel and the head of counterintelligence, who was Captain Sheridan Cavett. His specialty would be foreign technology. So already they're demonstrating not only can they not identify this wreckage, but now they're questioning whether it be maybe a foreign design. So Blanchard would then contact his commanding officer, who pictured here is General Roger Ramey. Ramey was the head of the 8th Air Force, which was headquartered at Carswell Army Airfield in Fort Worth, Texas. Now, Ramey was not available. He was in Denton, Texas at that weekend. It was a holiday weekend, 4th of July weekend. And Ramey was at the dedication of a plane, as well as spending time with his family away from headquarters in Denton, Texas. So next slide. So it was Ramey's chief of staff, who was Colonel Thomas DuBose, who would then contact the Pentagon. So again, we continue to now we've risen to the point that they're contacting the Pentagon about this wreckage in Roswell. And it's here, General Clements McMullen, pictured here. He was the deputy commander of Strategic Air Command. He quickly calls from the Pentagon. He contacts DuBose at Fort Worth, ordering him to immediately contact Blanchard at Roswell and have some of this material immediately flown to their attention in Washington. And I make this point, and I emphasize this point, because Washington already has wreckage in hand. This strange material, some of it brought in by the rancher. They have it by late evening, Sunday, July 6th. Next slide. Now, on Tuesday, July 8th, Roswell puts out that famous press release that they've recovered an actual flying saucer. In other words, the first atomic bomb squadron in the world announces, we've got one. Now, General Ramey would then announce that he was going to have a press conference. They were going to show the public the pieces of the flying saucer. But they weren't going to do this in Roswell. No, they were going to do this in Fort Worth. So Major Marcel, who I'd mentioned earlier, the head of intelligence, is ordered to take some of the wreckage. They load it onto a B-29 bomber called Dave's Dream. They arrive in Fort Worth. Major Marcel would put some of the wreckage on General Ramey's desk. General Ramey would take him to a map room to look at the location. And when they return, Marcel is shocked to see that the actual wreckage has been removed. Someone has taken it from the office. And in its place is a clump of rotting neoprene weather balloon, rubber balloon, and a radar reflector kite of foil, wooden sticks, string, and tape, off-the-shelf material which any 5-year-old child would recognize. Now, there's a hallway of reporters waiting to enter the room and witness the pieces just arrived from Roswell. But General Ramey would only allow a single reporter into the room, and that was James B. Johnson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Major Marcel is then ordered to pose with the substituted balloon. He holds up sections of the kite. Johnson takes the pictures. He's then ordered by General Ramey not to say a word to any of the outside reporters, not even to say a word to his wife when he returns back to Roswell, which would not be till the next evening. They would keep him overnight. So Roswell is quickly explained away as being nothing more than this weather balloon device, as you see on the screen, a neoprene rubber balloon. And if you see suspended from beneath it, it's a hexagonal radar reflector kite. Again, off-the-shelf material of common, substances that even a child would recognize. So the Pentagon also then goes into a quick level of demonstration. For the next few days, they would put on these public demonstrations of trying to not only explain away Roswell, but all of the flying saucer reports that were coming in day after day after day, banner headlines about the government's efforts to identify these flying discs, these flying saucers. In fact, even the very term flying saucer had just been coined days earlier from the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which took place on June 24th, just 10 days before Roswell. The search and rescue pilot by the name of Kenneth Arnold, who described these 9 crescent-shaped objects. And he would tell a reporter at the Oregonian newspaper by the name of Bill Bichette that over Mount Rainier, Washington, that they maneuvered like saucers skipping across the water. And it was Bichette who then termed the very phrase the term flying saucer. So UFO was not in use at the time. That wouldn't be for another 5 years. So they were calling them flying saucers, flying discs. And so the Army Air Corps, as instructed by the Pentagon, they go into this immediate effort, this damage control, to explain away Roswell and all of the flying saucer sightings during that summer as being these weather balloons. Okay, now the problem with Roswell is that fine, at a certain altitude, the balloons would compress from the air pressure. They could look elliptical. They would reflect the sun, and they may look unusual. They're devoid of, obviously, wings and tail section, so they could easily confuse an eyewitness as they bob and weave and might zigzag and might maneuver in such a way that it would look like it was not of any aircraft that we were aware of at that time. The problem with Roswell is that it's right on the ground in front of you. It's something that you can handle for all the eyewitnesses. And again, it would have been nothing more than rubber and foil and sticks and string and tape. There's the disconnect that the Air Force to this day, they still will never address. They would sooner have us believe that the #1 military squadron in the world in charge of the atomic bomb had less knowledge than a 5-year-old child in recognizing a very common weather balloon device. Next slide. So another example of where they were putting on these public demonstrations. You know, they just get up on a step ladder and they'd have the press all observing. And you see again, there's a couple balloons, it's a cluster balloon, and there will be an array of maybe 1, 2, even up to a half a dozen of these kites that would send back the instrument readings, the wind.
Oh, looks like we have Dawn disconnected. Dawn, are you there? Looks like Dawn froze up. He's still connected, but
Hold on, everyone. Georg, is he still?
yeah, looks
Just
like he's
frozen, but he's
reconnecting. He's reconnecting now, I believe. Dawn, are you with us?
I am back. Well, let's blame it on the powers that be, that they don't like what I'm saying.
Carry on, carry on.
Next slide. George, next slide.
Yeah. Do you see the gentleman?
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm going to add some commentary before we move on to the next slide. But the fact that this all happened from the first initial claim that they had recovered a flying saucer, and then within 5 hours explained away as being nothing more than this balloon device. What's interesting is that when we located the Christian Monitor newsletter and Associated Press reported on all the bulletins that were being exchanged between Washington and Fort Worth and Roswell, and you witnessed the slow evolution from the flying saucer into the weather balloon, as was all planned. That was, again, part of their agenda. Let's go to the next slide. So what's interesting is that at 6:17 that evening, the FBI Dallas Bureau office, they put out a teletype where they refuted the balloon explanation. So that same very day, within an hour after General Ramey had just explained away the entire event as this mundane, conventional object. And the original press information was that the wreckage from Roswell was going on to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, to Foreign Technology Division for analysis and an identification, a potential identification of what materials we were dealing with. Now, Wright Field was a predecessor to the now infamous Area 51. 51 did not even exist for another 8 years. And so it was Wright Field that did all the testing and all the attempts at reverse engineering of any captured Nazi technology, Japanese. If we so much as got our hands on a MiG fighter, a Russian MiG, it would go to Foreign Technology at Wright Field. Well, General Ramey, he canceled that flight. Well, I've just identified it. It's nothing more than a balloon device, nothing more to see here. End of story. But the FBI refuted that claim. And in fact, in that telex that very evening, they state that based on their telephonic conversation between their office, the FBI, and Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, this information is not borne out that it was something else. So it's rather ironic that the FBI, for their long-time reputation of the UFO phenomenon, they at least supported us in the notion that the materials that did go on the Wright Field, the materials, contrary to what Ramey had stated, did go on for testing and analysis at Wright Field, and the FBI backed up that claim. They backed up that situation. They refuted General Ramey's claim that this was nothing more than a balloon device. So the dilemma.
This gentleman is from the FBI. This gentleman we're seeing right now.
Okay, the dilemma that the Roswell Army Airfield, as well as all the way to Washington, that they had was the rancher when he came into town. He had already spoken to the media. This is Walt Whitmore Sr., who was the majority owner of radio station KGFL in Roswell. Next slide. So next slide. This was his on-air personality, the late Frank Joyce. We knew Frank very well. And Frank was the reporter who had talked to the rancher. And the rancher had actually described to him witnessing a number of the bodies, which were at another location 2.5 miles southeast of the debris field. And so this became the problem. The problem was that, as we all know, balloons don't have pilots. And yet the rancher is describing non-human bodies. In fact, Joyce would tell us that he was suggesting to the rancher, Brazil, that they're launching these rockets over at White Sands. Maybe they put a monkey into the nose cone of one of these craft. To which, according to Joyce, Brazil, from the sheriff's office, fired back into the phone, they weren't any damn monkeys, they weren't human. So again, no question, no doubt of what we were dealing with at that time. Next slide. So the military at Roswell, they then went about the process of finding Brazil. Now, contrary to their authority over the military, all military personnel, whether you're given an order and it's a dictatorship, you better follow it. Otherwise, you'll be court-martialed or you'll be put in a stockade, and I mean, you'll have hell to pay. Well, the military has absolutely zero authority over civilians unless martial law be declared. Well, they could hardly declare a state of emergency given that Roswell has just been explained away as being nothing more than a balloon. And so therein was the additional dilemma that the military forced. So what do? They kidnap the rancher. They would hold him out at the base for the next 5 days. Now, this is post weather balloon explanation. And they then would escort him to the radio stations, to the 2 newspapers in town, where he retracts, he recants the original story that this was a flying saucer. Now, when he's brought to radio station KGFL, Frank Joyce, pictured here in his latter years, is thrilled that he now has a chance to not only meet the original source of the story, to speak to him again, but to put him on the air, to actually talk to him about the true nature of this alleged flying saucer crash. Joyce proceeds to introduce Brazil on the air, and Brazil then goes on to describe the very conventional weather balloon. And he apologizes that everyone has got excited over nothing. He in no way intended to, have people overreact to something as common as a balloon. And he was sorry. He apologizes. Well, Frank Joyce is flabbergasted. He can't believe that he's gone from describing non-human remains at a flying saucer crash site, and now he is siding with the very authorities that have now made every effort to shut down this story. So he takes him off mic. They go into the lobby, and Joyce says to him, "This isn't what you originally told me. What's going on here? I mean, my God, what's happening?" And according to Joyce, Brazil turns and says, "Son, they told me it would go awful hard on me if I didn't do exactly as they told me." And then Joyce looks out through the front. Joyce looks out through the front doors, and he sees 2 military police standing there. And then he understands what's happening. He understands that he's doing this under coercion, that he's not doing this under his own volition. And then as the rancher starts to leave the radio station, Joyce still asks him, What about the little green men? To which Brazel turns back and he kind of very shyly smiles and he goes, but they weren't green. And then he leaves. So interesting that Brazel would still have the last word, but unfortunately, the newspapers, the radio stations are not allowed to put out the story. In fact, KGFL, which we're talking about, Judd Roberts, who was another reporter at the radio station, he receives a phone call at the same time as Joyce is speaking with Brazel from a TJ Slowey, who was a executive at the Federal Communications Committee in Washington. And they warn the radio station that if they said anything more, if they proceeded to put out anything further on the case, they would lose their license within 24 hours. So in other words, not only are we kidnapping civilians, not only are we threatening the media, we're threatening radio stations with the loss of their licenses. So in strict violation of their First Amendment, freedom of the press rights. This is again all post-weather balloon press conference in Fort Worth. That the damage control continues. So in other words, they're still making every effort to silence the witnesses, to shut them down, to shut down the press. And so this again in total contradiction to the balloon explanation. They continue to demonstrate that this is something much bigger, something extraordinary, something much larger. And so next slide. So during Brazel's detention at the military, they would take him to the media as I described, but Joyce is picked up the next morning, going to the radio station where he's picked up by his boss, Walt Whitmore Sr., and he's told to get into the back seat of the car. They are shocked then that a gentleman enters, a suit. They have no idea who this man is. He just sits down in the back seat next to Frank Joyce. And then Whitmore just drives on and he knows exactly where to go. They proceed, they go out to this one-room shack pictured here. It's called the Hines House. And Joyce is told to get into the building. This is 3 miles north of the debris field. And in walks Mac Brazel, W.W. Brazel once again. And Brazel says to Joyce, "You're not going to say another word about what has happened." And Joyce would say to him, "Well, not if you don't want me to." And Brazel says, "Good, because I need to know that. You're not to say another word." And then Brazel starts to exit and he turns back to Joyce and he says, "You know our lives will never be the same again." And Joyce says, "Well, I can see that will exactly be the situation." And then they part. Joyce is taken back to town. Brazel, he's kept for another few days at the base before he's finally allowed to return to once again take over his responsibilities on the ranch. But again, it continues to demonstrate that this was something much beyond the pale, that this was something way beyond a balloon or anything else. I also need to point out this is just post-World War II, where they have seen and experienced, especially the military, many of the atrocities of warfare and the way the country itself effectively was part of the war machine, that even the housewives, the women were working the factories. They were working to maintain as far as the equipment that was was provided to, which was feeding the war efforts in both the European theater as well as the South Pacific against Japan. So this was, for whatever reason, rising above that level, because now we're threatening civilians. We're threatening the media to maintain control and suppression of something that was beyond their comprehension. It was something that they could not identify. It was something that they could not understand. It intellectually was beyond their grasp. They could not bridge the technology. They had no idea what this was. Next slide. This was the sheriff I'd mentioned earlier. And when the rancher had come into town and he brought in some of the wreckage, he brought in boxes of the material. And the one box was retrieved by Major Marcel, taken back to the base. But the sheriff, he kept a box of the wreckage, and he kept it hidden in his office on the floor of a closet in that room. Well, his daughters would describe to us that, again, days after the military's explaining this, just wiping this away as being nothing more than a balloon, they hear a loud roar of vehicles approaching the courthouse. They seem to surround the building. And all at once, they hear a commotion of men coming in through the front entrance, coming in through the side door by the jail section, and coming in through the kitchen area, the cafeteria for the jail. And they come out to the upper hallway, which is from their living quarters, which overlooked the front lobby, which adjoined their father, the sheriff's office. And they watch their father being physically accosted by MPs with his arm twisted up behind his back and his face pushed up against the wall. And with drawn pistols, they order him to turn back, to give back the pieces of the wreckage brought in days before by Rancher Brazel. So now they're taking authority over the number one law enforcement officer in the entire county. And they force him to cooperate. They force him to turn over that box of wreckage. So again, we continue to see how the cover-up, the story, the level of extreme measures that the military took to contain this, to make sure that not only did they control the story, control the narrative, but that they also were in charge of the narrative of every last person who was involved with this. Next slide. This would include other civilians. This is, as far as his last name is, this is Peter Anaya, who was involved when all they did was they tried to go out to the base because they were civilian employees at the Roswell Army Airfield. And for nothing more than having tried to just fulfill their daily work schedule. Next slide. His wife, Mary, as well as Pete before he died, here's a younger picture of the two, described how the military came to their home and there was an argument that she overheard on the front lawn with a number of the officers from the base. And they were pointing fingers at her husband and they were threatening him. And when they left the area, left the home, and her husband came into the home and he instructed her, we're never to say another word about the incident. I'm never to even discuss it with you. And they've told me that if I ever do, they threaten you, they threatened our children. We will come to great harm if we ever discuss this again. So we have more and more people becoming involved. We're having now civilian workers at the base who are being threatened over this weather balloon. Next slide. Next slide. This is Frankie Rowe. Frankie Rowe was the daughter of crew chief at the Roswell Fire Department, Dan Dwyer. Now, Frankie had stopped at the firehouse right after a state police officer by the name of Robert Scroggins. He had finished his work for the day, which was Lincoln County, where the debris field was located. And he had received from Brazo a piece of the material, a piece of the wreckage. And it was specifically a piece of the memory material. It was different than this paper-thin, nearly indestructible wreckage that both military and civilian described. Even engineers at the base described how they took a 16-pound sledgehammer and they proceeded to pound on this wreckage and it wouldn't even scratch. And there were silken strands of material like microfilament fishing line. You could hold a light up the one end and the light would emit. It would come out the opposing end. Well, they're describing fiber optics. Back in 1947, yet fiber optics wouldn't, come into vogue until around 1970. And there were I-beam structures of this same nearly indestructible material with strange symbols that ran the length of each piece, never deciphered, never decoded. And then the piece that Frankie would handle, that she would hold in her hands, and she, like all the other witnesses, described it to us as follows. There's a piece that this police officer, this state police officer, Robert Scroggins, in his excitement for having received it from rancher Brazo, he wanted his friends, his buddies, his pals to see at the firehouse. So he brought it in the Roswell, and they were passing it from person to person. And Frankie, who had just merely stopped by to visit with her dad at the firehouse, she got to hold it. She said it was like quicksilver. She said it was like water flowing through her hands, that when she would release the grip, because this material, you could crease, you could fold, you could crumble into a ball. And each and every time you would place it down, it would unfurl, it would unravel. It would flow like water as it would assume its original shape and size. In other words, it possessed perfect memory. So Frankie got to hold this. And if we could just move back a slide. This is First Lieutenant Arthur Philbin. He was a former New York State police officer. And just because he served as a liaison with the base security, the military police at the base, and the local police in Roswell, we immediately suspected that he would have been, one of the primary people involved with the incident. And we were correct, because that evening, who should arrive at Dan Dwyer's home? And Dan was still at the firehouse. So it was Mrs. Dwyer and Frankie. She retreated to her bedroom with her younger sister, Dory. And Frankie would hear an argument out in the kitchen about, where's your daughter? Where is your daughter? And finally, there's footsteps down the hallway. And in through the bedroom door is this officer, First Lieutenant Arthur Philbin. And he's pounding a baton into his hands. And he has two other MPs with him. And she threatens Frankie. I mean, he threatens Frankie. He tells her that if she should ever utter another word about what she saw at the firehouse, that they would pick her up, they would take her deep into the desert, and they would never find her again. Now, Frankie is a 14-year-old girl at the time. So now we're threatening children. Again, ladies and gentlemen, all over a balloon. And I keep emphasizing that because it still stands as the official explanation from Washington up till today. It's the second and the third official explanation regarding Roswell. Damn all the witnesses. It doesn't matter that we have tracked down and interviewed over 600 witnesses who were either directly or indirectly involved with what happened back in July of 1947. The Washington, the Pentagon, they have zero witnesses to any of the alternative. There's a subsequent explanations. We have over 600. They have zero. So who do you believe would win in a court of law? We know we would. Beyond a shadow of a doubt. We've had lawyers, we've even had judges tell us that we would win hands down, because in just being able to demonstrate that this fallout, this attempt to again shut down the case, was all post weather balloon press conference, that they were still making sure that the witnesses cooperated, that the media did not put out the story any further, that they were able to close the door on Roswell once and for all. Next slide. There's Frankie again. Next slide. There's the firehouse from 1947, where they were passing around the piece of memory material. Next slide. There's her father, Dan Dwyer, pictured in the middle. He was the crew chief of the fire department at that time. Next slide. Another ranch daughter, her father was involved. He owned some of the ranch land north of town. And he was the owner of the local Ford station. And as a result, he happened to be out at the ranch where the bodies were recovered. And he would describe them and then warn her thereafter that they were threatened, that they threatened they would kill the children as well. Next slide. That's the Ford dealership back in 47. Next slide. Pictured to the left is, he was a aeronautical engineer at Boeing in 1947. The name was Richard Loveridge. And Loveridge, who happened to have homes in Roswell as well as in Texas. I believe it was Dallas. And he happened to arrive in Dallas, and he was told to get over to Roswell. He was a crash investigator. And upon arriving in Roswell, he was instructed to go out to this location, the crash site. And they wanted his perspective as a crash investigator. Now, he wasn't allowed to see anything close up, but he would tell his family thereafter that what he saw clearly was not of any balloon, was not of any aircraft. It wasn't of anything he could recognize. And then as he started to hear more and more talk about bodies being recovered, this was something he would pass on to his children up until the time of his death in the mid-1990s. Next slide. This was Mac Brazel, the rancher. He also was a security guard years later. He's pictured in the middle here. He's with his two sons, Paul, as well as Bill. We had extensive interviews with Bill, And a quick story with Bill. Bill, who was out at the ranch during his father's detainment at the Roswell Army Airfield, when they were getting him to change his story, to change his account of what had transpired. And Bill described to us that after heavy rains, that he would always ride through that very location, and pieces of the original wreckage would wash to the surface. Now, mind you, that during the actual cleanup, the recovery operation, from all accounts of the men who were involved that we've interviewed, it took 50 to 60 troops, 3 full days to clean up the site, to remove every shard and piece of physical evidence. Yet they knew they didn't, recover every last piece. So Bill Jr. talked about how weeks thereafter, for a month thereafter, he would ride the area and he would retrieve another piece or two, including the memory material. He found enough pieces, scraps as he would call it, to fill up a cigar box. So it was sometime thereafter that he was in the nearest town of Corona. He was at Wade's bar. He was playing pool one evening with a number of friends. Well, it came up. One of his friends asked Bill, for all that commotion and all that trouble that your dad got in by reporting that, did you ever find any pieces yourself? And Bill Jr. makes the mistake of acknowledging that he had. He admitted that, as he put it, yes, I found a few scraps. Well, who should be at his home the very next morning but a captain by the name of Emerson Armstrong, who we have verified that he was the one who was there. He was there with 3 other non-commissioned officers, and Armstrong basically stated to Bill Brazel, we know what you have and you will turn it over to us. Well, the military post-World War II walked on water. Whatever the military told you, you abided, you accepted, you followed their instructions. So he turned over the shoebox, or I should say the cigar box. Well, they then had Brazel take them out to the location and point out where he found these pieces, and they examined the area. But unbeknownst to Brazel, while they were 3 miles away from the ranch house, there were other MPs that came to the house. They entered it without any search warrant of any sort. Again, the military doesn't utilize search warrants, but they entered uninvited. They ransacked the place. They pulled out, as far as dresser drawers. They flipped over bedroom as far as mattresses. They went outside and they slid open bags of feed for the cattle and horses. They tipped over a water tank, all in an effort to still search for any remaining pieces of physical evidence. And I can't emphasize enough, this was 2 years after the incident. So for 2 years, they were still monitoring the witnesses. They were still watching the ranches in the event they should find any physical evidence. So again, now we're 2 years beyond the event, and we're still monitoring the event. We're still making sure that we are quickly there to pounce on and retrieve any evidence to the contrary, any evidence that would destroy their balloon story. So the military is still not done with the witnesses. Next slide. This was the rancher's daughter. This is Bessie Brazel Schreiber. And she was coerced by the military in the mid-1990s to claim that it was nothing more than a balloon.
Excuse
And
me, Don.
yes,
Georg unfortunately has to leave, so he can't continue to do the slides. Is it possible for you to do them?
well, we
Or-
can wrap it up. We can wrap it up because I'm almost at the end.
Oh, okay, cool.
So,
Cool.
just do one more slide, George.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Bill Brazel's daughter. She was there when the military came in 2 years after the event and ransacked the house. Next slide. Robert Shirkey, who witnessed the wreckage. Next slide. Earl Telesco, he was part of the recovery operation. Next slide. Frederick Benethal, he was a photographer. He was brought in from Washington to photograph the bodies. Next slide. This was Eddington. He was one of the guards posted behind a B-29 when they loaded up the bodies. Next slide. This is the officers. I'm going to have you jump. The lower right hand is Major Patrick Saunders. I'm going to have you go to this next slide. He was the base adjutant. Next slide. And that's the cover, paperback edition of our Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell book. And next slide. And we're going to end with this because I feel that this is certainly, as a deathbed testimony, one of the most incriminating pieces of information that we could have presented in a court of law. Now, I mentioned that Patrick Saunders was the base adjutant. He had a top security clearance with the Roswell Army Airfield in regards to the atomic bomb. He was in charge of all base operation at that time. Now, when we had tracked him down in the early 1990s, and I interviewed him over the phone, and he kept jokingly making reference to the men from Mars. He kept joking about, oh, that was that incident where they claimed that we thought we had recovered a spaceship from Mars, and he just kept laughing about it, and there was nothing to it. Well, a few years later, after he had sustained a bad fall from a roof, and he suffered a bad head injury, he bought up as many of our paperback copies of our second book, Truth About UFO Crash at Roswell. And he gave copies to his children, to his family, and to a number of his best friends. And in the inner leaf of the book, he wrote what you see there. Here's the truth. And I still haven't told anyone anything. Signed, Patrick Saunders. Now, we always thought he was referring to the entire book, but this is the inner leaflet of the book. So it's an overview. It's a bit of an introduction. So then we realized he was speaking specifically of this statement, because we would learn from the family that Saunders would brag about how they had shut down the entire case, how he was responsible for essentially shutting down the military, keeping them from ever catching on to the military, knowing much more about the event than we were ever led to believe. And I'm going to read what we state on this page, because this is what Saunders was agreeing with. He was stating on his deathbed, he was stating before he died, that this is the truth. This is what they did in maintaining as far as the truthfulness of the entire Roswell incident. And it reads, damage control. Files were altered. So were personal records, along with assignments and various codings and code words. Changing serial numbers ensured that those searching later would not be able to locate those who were involved in the recovery. Individuals were brought into Roswell from Alamogordo, Albuquerque, and Los Alamos. The MPs, the military police, were a special unit constructed of military police elements from Kirtland, which is in Albuquerque, Alamogordo, which was Holloman Airfield, and Roswell. If the men didn't know one another, they would be unable to compare notes, and that would make the secret easier to keep. After the impact site was cleaned, the soldiers debriefed, and the bodies and the craft removed, silence fell. It would not be broken for almost 45 years. And that's when Major Marcel went public and described what actually had happened prior to his death. So, we got a deathbed, which then started the entire chain of events leading to over 600 witnesses that all verify, all agree, all demonstrate, down to the MPs that were brought in from outside, the doctors and nurses that arrived from outside the base, the outside personnel that were involved as far as with the entire recovery operation, because we quickly saw that the personnel at Roswell were piecemealed. They selected one from this squadron, one from that unit, because as we just described in this damage control description, that when all the dust clears, you have no one to exchange notes with. You're the lone individual who was involved. You were the lone individual who was picking up pieces out in the desert. It wasn't your entire squadron, your entire unit. And that was how ingenious this all was. So we could go on literally for hours. In fact, I still have over 35 slides, and I have over 3,000 images that we could easily revert to. But we need to quickly wrap this up. And if anyone has any questions or comments, but I hope you get an idea why this is the granddaddy of them all, because we're not just pointing to something very fleeting in the sky. We're talking about the United States government taking into its possession actual pieces of the genuine article, pieces that to this day they can't find the on button, so to speak. And as a result, that's why our efforts in tracking down every last person involved still, as we raced with the Undertaker, as we like to describe our efforts in that manner, and we are still very fluid. In fact, I don't think even Jim knows this. In the last month, we've tracked down and come up with 6 more families whose fathers were involved. And to their deathbeds, it did happen, ladies and gentlemen. It did happen. So with that, Jim, I'll turn it back to you. And so I get passionate. I get passionate because it is, again, it's that exciting.
Clearly.
It's that exciting.
Clearly.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So we've witnessed the mind of a researcher, everyone, and an investigator who's really gone into the details, the nitty gritty, and really brought to light in a way I hadn't really taken in till I just sat here listening to you, Don, the extraordinary lengths that the government went through over time.
Yes.
To repress the information and not allow the people working on the repression of the information to know the whole story, so they didn't even know.
No.
It's really, really remarkable. And it all started.
Can you imagine quickly, Jim, that in the detainment, the kidnapping of the rancher, Brazil, for those 5 days, that when he was returned back to the ranch, and with his family. He kept talking about the indignity. He kept talking about the indignity. How dare they? How dare they? I mean, I was so humiliated. I was so embarrassed. Well, they subjected him to a full body cavity search while he was, in their possession. Full body cavity. I mean, does anyone believe they were looking for pieces of a weather balloon? So, I mean, again, I'm sorry.
Well, listen, I know that time is limited and your time is limited, so I think we'll bring this to a close so you can go into our after chat and have a
Please.
more informal Q&A with our community. So we'll bring this to a close, but I just want everybody to know in closing that Don is going to be doing 2 courses for us following Danny Sheehan and Richard Dolan and others for our New Paradigm Institute training program and certificate program leading to master's and PhD degrees in terms of the partnership with Ubiquity University. So Don is going to be back on Humanity Rising. He's going to be providing courses. And as I indicated at the beginning, he's one of the great minds, one of the great researchers in this whole domain. So we're honored, Don, to have you with us. And then tomorrow we'll be hearing from a theologian who's going to discuss the issue of the UFOs and God.
Yes.
What are the implications? So you'll see the link to the after chat in the chat box that Stan just put in the chat. And Don, you received it in your Zoom invite. So if you go to your Zoom invite that you clicked on earlier today, you'll see you just scroll down and the link is right there.
Right.
And then we'll see you in the after chat. And then we'll see everybody then tomorrow for a further discussion of the UFO phenomenon. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Don. It was brilliant.
Thank you, Jim.
Brilliant.
My pleasure.
Bye, everyone.